Hello and welcome to Lutra TV. Over the next few episodes we'll be discussing water scarcity, what it means, where we can potentially focus our efforts, and how we can actually respond to this going forwards. Now before we get started, I thought I'd like to go around the room and just do a quick introduction to our panel members. So I'll start with you, Amanda, and we'll just work back around this side.
Sure, my name is Amanda Slater. I'm a Senior Process Engineer at Lutra.
My name is Julian Fyfe. I'm the Regional Manager for Water Infrastructure at AWA Environmental.
And Quentin Griffiths, I'm the Chief Executive Officer here at Lutra.
Jonathan Church, Principal Process Engineer at Lutra.
And Lesley Smith, I'm a Projects Coordinator at WaterNZ.
Well, thank you all for taking the time to join us today. I think to really kick things off, I'd like perhaps someone to go around the room and just describe what water scarcity is. I think we all have a rough understanding of what it is, but if someone could maybe give a bit of a deeper definition to water scarcity.
I'll start. I came from Australia, so we've had plenty of experience. Water scarcity to me is obviously a imbalance between supply and demand, and whether that imbalance is caused by high demand or constraints on the supply side, whether that be source or other constraints. But essentially you cannot meet the demand for water with the water that is available to you, or with the treated water that's available to you in an urban setting, that is.
Yes. I guess outside of just purely that water treatment aspect, is there any other, descriptions we should kind of consider when we look at water scarcity?
Absolutely. It ranges right from the source through to the tap. All the factors that can affect scarcity or can contribute to scarcity. Wellington's a perfect example of leakage in the network, in the distribution network, that's causing a degree of scarcity in the summer period when the demand peaks. And so you've got the underlying demand from the leakage, and then demand from customers that peaks with the summer holiday season and hot weather.
When you say the word scarcity, do we mean scarcity in terms of, the population being the user, the industrial users, or the supplier facing the scarcity? I'm just wondering in terms of, using the word scarcity like food scarcity. Obviously, people don't get enough to eat, but in the context of like a water supply, what's the practical implication of a scarcity?
Well, there's a time element to it, I'd imagine, because a 2-day disruption is very different to a 30-day loss of supply. And who's impacted by that outage is also important. There's very large customers that could be more impacted than you'd expect from a shortage, even a short-term shortage, I suppose, like hospitals, for example. But industrial users, they're the drivers of the economy, so if they go out for a few days, that could cause major disruptions. And the idea of scarcity is it's the being able to access the water that is that is available, and it's the scarcity to the customer ultimately. And then I suppose as you move up the chain, the utilities access to the source, whether it be regulated by policy or through another organisation, or physical limitation.
And is it a little bit, because we're talking about urban water systems, the type of scarcity is maybe a little bit different to what people would be thinking about if we were talking about water scarcity in terms of agricultural systems and the like. And I feel like that creates different drivers for water scarcity as well. So instead of just having drought conditions driving water scarcity, as I guess is probably the larger issue for agricultural producers, I feel like in our urban water networks, the range of factors that can lead you into water scarcity is quite a lot broader. Like, it's not just the absence of rain. Sometimes heavy rainfall creates turbidity in the catchments, and then we have treatment capacity issues, and so there can be flow-on water scarcity impacts from that as well. So there's probably, in this urban water context, a few other bottlenecks and factors to think about.
Yeah, indeed.
So I guess it is all quite front of mind, particularly here in Wellington, New Zealand, just around, in this water scarcity that we've had over the summer. And as you mentioned before, it's primarily been driven by leaks. I guess, has anyone else had experience outside of the, I guess, Wellington context or New Zealand context with water scarcity?
Yeah, I mean, it's at least from a production of drinkable water perspective, you know, there's multiple suppliers which face constraints in how much they can actually access. So it's not so much the amount of water that might be leaking away once produced, but being able to actually access the raw water to process, you know, and be that a case of a climate effect, such as drought, which obviously reduces it, or a consenting limit, which may limit the amount of water that you're allowed to take because the downstream users, which be it agriculture or whatever, still need their take. So I mean, there is more to it than just the people using the water. There's also the production side. Yes. And that is definitely an issue across New Zealand, yeah.
I think, Lesley, you mentioned in an earlier discussion around some of the experience you had while you're over in Australia also.
Yeah, so I guess my entry point, and I'm very grateful for it, into the water sector was through drought. So I joined the water sector in 2009, and to anybody that's visited Australia during those kind of 2000s, that first decade of the 2000s, they'll probably remember the Millennium Drought. It was a really big deal for Australia. And at that time, Melbourne's reservoirs had got down to around about 25% of their capacity. And I think their thought was that the bottom 16% of the reservoirs was going to be almost unworkable. Just the turbidity and the like in the bottom of the reservoirs was going to be problematic. So that drought was really interesting. It drove a transformational change in the way that water was managed in Melbourne. Not only did they bring on massive new sources and a huge desalination plant, which will forever change the nature of their water supply mix, there was also a huge mindset change in consumers across Melbourne region, and that the campaign that they ran, the Target 155 campaign, was so forefront of the public's mind during that period. It wasn't just that the water company was campaigning. You'd look around you and you'd see fields drying out and you'd see trees dying, and so there was a lot of visible reminders of the impact that water scarcity had. But I mean, that created a real opportunity, I think, for the water companies to shift consumer behaviour in a way that actually, even since post the drought, has stayed and has given them, I guess, a sounder basis to weather future droughts. So gardens have been transformed into drought-proof gardens. Homes have water-efficient fixtures that they didn't have before, and it was a big shift.
And similar to Auckland in the 90s with the drought. You know, everyone probably remembers the lead weights that you could attach to the toilet cistern to limit water, you know, but those aren't standard anymore, so it's, yeah.
And also, I guess, the more recent example with, I guess, trying to bring Waikato 50 online. Again, just trying to build some of that resilience around the water supply, particularly in periods of scarcity or particularly dry years. So I think that's always kind of an interesting aspect there. Has anyone else got any other examples in that kind of water scarcity which perhaps they've dealt with directly?
So I think I've been in the water industry directly for about 4 years now, but prior to that I started my career in the pharmaceutical industry, which uses a phenomenal amount of water in the production processes. So water scarcity in that sense is, I guess, less on the supply side and more how you use these resources in the most responsible and efficient way. I think in more recent years it's possibly become something that's become more front of mind, especially as things like abstraction consents come up for renewal and the conditions get tighter, or we do see more of these sort of drought and scarcity conditions where suddenly everybody's been asked to use less, and so implementing your water reuse and recovery processes as part of your production process is something that's now being implemented, perhaps more so now than it had been previously. You see that as well in like the dairy industry. I know Fonterra are doing some good work around implementing resource recovery and reuse processes as well.
So do you think we have genuinely got to the point where abstract consent conditions have got tough enough to drive the investment that's needed to create more efficient practices when, you know, volumetric pricing remains fairly low?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably a useful lever that can be used. I think, you know, in the commercial industrial space, obviously, to implement something like a resource recovery process, it's a big financial investment, so you've got to come up with a sound business case to be able to implement that. And maybe 20, 30 years ago, you were never going to get that across the line because there's no value in it. These days, as you start to assess, you know, your risk and your supply security, it's becoming more palatable. And I think on top of that as well, for organisations, you know, the value of your environmental credentials for your branding and your public perception is maybe also something that can be added into that business case to be more responsible with how you use all resources, really, in energy as well as water, but obviously water specifically for what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, if the water's, you're at the hard edge of your abstraction consent, but you know you're generating X amount, 10% of it is waste, it's definitely a case for being more efficient. The question is really whether that 10% is enough to make up for what you're going to need, you know.
And often it's not. It's also at the other end, your discharge consent as well, and your limits for that. So the more you can keep everything within that closed system, so the better from an efficiency point of view.
Making the business cases probably getting a bit more sophisticated because you can bring in obviously hot water, energy savings, trade waste discharges, all these things into the... And so I know examples of a commercial laundry in Lower Hutt that has invested heavily in water recycling and have seen the benefits within years, and they're just absolutely committed to driving down their water use without any other driver. You know, they just saw the benefit, the financial benefit to the company and just chased it.
So I mean, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, and where we're kind of going with some of these discussions, as well as, I guess, where we lead in some of the mitigations. But I guess if we just take a step back, what would you say would be some of the key causes of water scarcity? So I know we've talked quite a bit about drought, and there was mention before of climate change and the impact that it's having on just what we expect in terms of weather patterns annually. What other drivers are there for water scarcity outside of purely a weather pattern?
One that faced both the utility I worked in Australia and Wellington Water is minimum flows in rivers. And so as that drive to protect aquatic ecosystems and the health, the mana of water, those minimum flows are slowly being raised, and that reduces the allocations available to the various users. And so in Western New South Wales where I worked, there was the council drew from a large river that was heavily subscribed by irrigators. Their contribution to the take was minuscule. But even that was controversial because of the scale of the take and the sheer number of people who depended so heavily on this water. And so that council, we built resilience through additional sources. So there are 3 sources, plus went to water recycling for non-potable uses. In Wellington, it's a similar situation with the Hutt River. The minimum flows are projected to probably be increased in the 2030s, and that will push the consent limits down and make it very difficult to, you know, supply the water from just that source.
And so I guess that's where we mentioned before that I guess some of those other levers there that are driving that as well. So you've got that kind of source aspect in terms of how much you can abstract or how much is available due to maybe droughts or weather conditions. I guess there's a flip side of that as well as I guess that consumer side and the behaviour, right, and how much people are consuming. And I know, you know, the primary case here in Wellington is just the pure leakage rate, so how much water loss there is, you know, through our day-to-day operations. So there's those kind of drivers as well. Outside of, I guess, purely leakage rates and maybe consumption, is there any other key drivers you see? Yeah,
I mean, it's similar to what you said before, Lesley. It's the quality is the other one. So, you know, given that there is going to be population growth, and yes, you can improve the efficiency of how people use water and industries use water, there's still going to be an increase in water usage, right? But it seems to be getting into a situation where there's no easy water anymore. And whether that's easy to access or easy to treat or easy to store. It's become quite a challenge. So, you're looking at technologically sophisticated solutions to treat the water, and the end point of that is desalination. There's a big ocean out there that can be used. But the quality, it also affects how much you can take and how much you can process and how much it costs. Be it groundwater, which would normally not be used, or surface water, which is suddenly being influenced by cyanobacteria or whatever the case may be. All of these challenges are going to affect the availability of the water, whether it's there or not.
Yeah, there's quite a big infrastructure piece sitting between that source water availability and the consumer, isn't there? It's like not just your treatment plant capacity, it's your network condition, the condition of the pipes, and it's also, I suppose, about like your available storage capacity. If you've got a couple of more Te Marua lakes that you can bring online, maybe that helps. But
I mean, people always say that New Zealand has lots and lots of water, and it's true. There's a lot flowing, especially when it rains. But the major problem is storing it. And it's and if we could store all the water that we needed, great. But it takes up huge amounts of land.
Well, exactly. In Australia, it's quite a different proposition, drought. It's years because the reservoirs are so large. Like you flood whole valleys. Here it's not palatable, it's not, it's not done many places. Auckland has one, a large reservoir, but it's not really an option for Wellington. And often, it's a bit of a common call, isn't it? That it's not a water availability issue, it's a storage issue. It's not entirely that, but certainly it's a big factor.
Yeah, because you're weighing up the as you say, the potential environmental effect and the cost of an enormous dam against a high-tech solution, which also may have a very small footprint relative to a storage dam, but has other implications, on the environment, and it's going to be energy intensive, chemical intensive, all that sort of thing. So,
I think
and
it
there's a lot in
pays
between there.
totally, and there's some of those high-tech solutions are storage solutions too, with people doing managed aquifer recharge, and that's tech, that's complicated when you're working under the ground and you can't see what you're dealing with. But some parts of the world are achieving it, so maybe that will be an option that gets traction here as we move forward and this becomes more of an issue.
Yeah, I guess leading on from that. Is this something we expect to see more of or less of in the years to come?
I'd say years. I mean, unless the population growth drops to zero, it's pretty unlikely. And even assuming efficiency increases and all that sort of thing, there will be a growth in the amount of water, and at the same time there's going to be a decrease probably in the availability of most water sources. So
you can feel all those crushing global mega trends of population growth and all the emerging environmental contaminants,
that as well,
our constrained resources and increasing costs of doing everything just sort of slowly piling up on the water sector. And it feels like we've reached that moment in time where we're starting to wake up to some of the challenges.
Although I'd argue that efficiency, like certainly on the water loss front, I mean, if you removed all of the water losses from Wellington's network, you'd meet growth for the next, out to 2050 possibly. It's actually a huge amount, and that combined with other user water efficiency can get you a long way, and it should never be discounted because it's cheap. Like it's super cheap compared to building new supply, new sources, new infrastructure, and it doesn't matter whether you only get 5 megalitres or 20 megalitres per day out of it. It's still a contribution that's just should happen first for every sustainability argument, for spending money wisely, etc., etc.
Well, it's water you don't have to take out and treat, and it's win-win essentially. It's
also interesting that water itself is quite cheap compared to, say, electricity or what we pay on our telco bills. Like I think our average electricity bill for a household in New Zealand is sitting just north of $2,000, and for a water bill, although there's huge regional variation around New Zealand, it's more like $1,000. So I'm not saying that people have heaps of money in their back pockets spare to pay higher water bills, but it's interesting to think about how undervalued it is as a resource compared to some of the other commodities, which we pay a lot more for.
And that was kind of the angle I was going to go there as well. Is I think part of this whole water scarcity discussion actually comes around the value that people put on water, which is quite interesting because it's one of the main kind of life givers for everything on Earth. Yet, as a population, we generally, I guess, value it quite lowly, and part of that is just in terms of the value we physically pay for it.
Yes.
Through either rates recovery or directly through a water bill. So I think there's always been, it falls out of the sky, it somehow makes it to my tap. It should be cheap. It should almost be free. And I think it's just that lack of understanding between of where actually it's not as easy as just taking this out of the sky and putting it into your taps. There's a lot more that goes into this. It costs a lot of money, and those costs are only increasing. So I think it's probably about that education piece there as well, in terms of, I guess, driving people to understand the value behind water, and that it is a limited commodity. It is not, in endless supply.
Yeah, and it's difficult, isn't it? Because you think of that example of taking water from a river at the expense of minimum flows. It's incredibly difficult, impossible basically, to put the value on the river staying healthy. So that's the kind of thing that doesn't get considered in this.
That's one thing that big reservoirs kind of helped in Australia, because you've got this measure that everyone can kind of understand. Just your dam levels at 20%. Whereas here it's more complicated. You're running on shorter time windows, and storages, and you don't have those measures that are really easy to comprehend and share and explain how dire a situation you might be in.
From that side, I guess that kind of covers what we're looking to talk about here today, which was what is water scarcity and what are some of the causes to it. In our next episode, we'll actually start looking at what some of these potential mitigations are, such as education, and how we actually progress forwards from there as an industry so that we can actually start putting some value behind this. Thanks for watching this episode on Lutra TV. Keep an eye out for our next episode on water scarcity.